Hey everyone, and welcome back to Investing Talk podcast. This week, we're going to be looking at a stock that's been making some pretty big moves, and not necessarily in a good way. Vistra Corp, ticker symbol VSTT, did a pretty dramatic plunge last Friday.
Yeah, it was a big one. 28%. Definitely something that's going to make people pay attention.
Yeah, so it opened at $154.09, even went up at one point to $156.93, but then closed at a pretty dismal $137.08. What happened?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Especially when you consider that Vistra had just had a really phenomenal earnings report just a couple months ago in November. They reported a GAAP net income of $1.837 billion with a cash flow from operations of $1.702 billion.
And the earnings per share were amazing, $5.25, absolutely crushing analyst expectations of $1.24.
Right, so you would think that the stock would be,
Yeah.
taking off, not plummeting.
Exactly. That's what's so confusing. I mean, it's like getting a perfect report card and then being told you're failing the class. What gives your S?
Well, you know the stock market. It's not always rational. It's driven by a really complex mix of different factors. Company performance, investor sentiment, economic trends, even global events. So it's possible that Vistra's drop was maybe partly due to profit-taking by investors who bought in earlier, and then after that, really impressive earnings report, decided to cash out.
So they saw the stock price going up and decided to sell high. Makes sense, but still, 28% is a huge swing.
Absolutely. And, we can't ignore the upcoming earnings report either. That's scheduled for February 26th, so investors might be holding back a little bit, kind of waiting to see, what kind of guidance Vistra provides for the future before they make any big moves.
That makes sense. So we have this really strong earnings report in November, followed by this massive drop. And now everyone's just kind of waiting on the edge of their seats for the next earnings report. Talk about a roller coaster. So for investors, what should they be thinking about right now?
Well, let's look at some of the technical indicators. Currently, VST is trading below both its 50-day moving average, which is $155.05, and its 200-day moving average, which sits at about $108.61.
Now, for those who might not be as familiar with moving averages, can you break that down a little bit?
Sure. So a moving average, it's basically just a line on a chart that shows the average price of a stock over a certain period of time. So in this case, we're looking at 50 days and 200 days. When a stock drops below those averages, it can indicate a bearish trend, meaning that the stock is more likely to continue going down in the short term.
So not really a good sign for Vistra there.
Yeah.
But could it also potentially be a buying opportunity, like if the stock is oversold?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's definitely possible. Some investors look for those dips below the moving averages as a signal to buy, hoping to catch the stock before it bounces back up. But it's a risky move. You really have to be confident in the company's long-term prospects.
Okay, so we have the moving averages, sort of pointing toward a bearish trend. What other technical indicators should investors be paying attention to?
Well, another important one is the RSI, the Relative Strength Index. Right now, VST has an RSI of 63.22.
And remind me again what that means.
Right, so the RSI, it measures how quickly and how strongly a stock's price is moving, up or down. So a reading above 70 usually means that the stock is overbought, meaning that it's risen too quickly, and it might be due for a correction. A reading below 30 suggests the opposite. The stock is oversold, and it could be poised for a rebound.
Okay, so Vistra at 63.2, sort of in the middle there, but edging towards overbought territory. What does that tell us?
Well, it suggests that the buying momentum might still be pretty strong. But we could also see a pullback or a correction in the near future. You can kind of think of it like a rubber band. If you stretch it too far, it's likely to snap back.
That's a great analogy. So this tension between a strong buying momentum and the possibility of a correction, it sounds like it's a real nail-biter for anybody holding VST. So let's bring in another layer of analysis here. What are the analysts saying?
Well, the analyst opinions are actually pretty mixed, which just adds to the uncertainty. BMO Capital Markets has a very bullish price target of $191, while JP Morgan Chase is more conservative at $178. So this wide range of opinions really shows that even the experts aren't quite sure what's going to happen next.
Yeah, that's kind of reassuring, actually. It makes me feel a little less clueless.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nobody has a crystal ball. Even the pros can get it wrong sometimes.
All right, so we've looked at the recent price drop, the strong earnings, technical indicators, and the analyst opinions. It's a lot to digest. So the big question now is, what should our listeners do with VST right now? Hold or fold?
I think that's the question that everybody wants to know, and unfortunately there's no easy answer. It really depends on your individual circumstances, your risk tolerance,
Yeah.
and your investment goals.
Right. We can't give personalized financial advice, but we can offer some insights to help our listeners make more informed decisions.
Absolutely, and I think the first step is to understand the broader context. You know in which Vistra operates. They're in the energy sector, which is undergoing a massive transformation right now.
Right. You can't ignore the elephant in the room, this shift towards renewable energy sources.
Exactly, and that's a really key factor to consider when you're evaluating Vistra's long-term prospects.
Okay, so let's dive into that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
How is Vistra positioned within this energy transition? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What are the risks and opportunities?
Well, one of the main challenges for Vistra is that they're really heavily reliant on traditional power generation, specifically coal.
And that doesn't sound very sustainable
Yeah.
in a world that's, you know, increasingly focused on clean energy.
Right. And investors are becoming more and more concerned about, the environmental impact of companies like Vistra.
So how is Vistra responding to this pressure? Are they making any moves towards renewables?
They are. They've actually been investing in solar and wind power projects in recent years, but the transition is slow and it's complex.
Right. It's not as simple as just flipping a switch.
Exactly. It takes time, it takes money, and it takes a lot of strategic planning to shift from a fossil fuel-based business model to a more sustainable one.
So for our listeners that are holding VST, this energy transition is definitely something to keep a close eye on. It could have a major impact on the company's future performance.
Absolutely. And it raises a really crucial question. How will Vistra navigate this transition in the long term? Will they be able to adapt and thrive in this rapidly changing energy landscape? Or will they get left behind?
Those are some big questions, and I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear your thoughts on how this might play out.
Well, predicting the future is always tricky, especially in a dynamic sector like energy. But I do think Vistra has a few things working in its favor.
Like what? Give us some hope here.
Well, first of all, they have a strong track record of profitability. Remember those stellar earnings we talked about? That gives them a solid foundation to invest in new technologies and adapt to changing market conditions.
So they have the resources to actually make the changes.
Exactly.
Okay, good.
Secondly, they're not just sitting back and, waiting for this energy transition to happen to them. They're actively investing in renewable energy projects, as we mentioned earlier.
The solar and the wind initiatives.
Exactly. They're also exploring other options like battery storage and carbon capture technologies. So, they're clearly aware of the need to diversify their portfolio and reduce their carbon footprint.
So they're making moves. Even if they're a little slow, what else should investors be thinking about?
Well, Vistra also has a significant presence in Texas, which is a rapidly growing market for electricity.
And Texas is known for being very pro-story, pro-business, and energy independent.
Right. So that regulatory environment could be really beneficial for Vistra. As they navigate this transition, they also have a really large and loyal customer base, which provides some stability.
Okay, so we've got financial strength, investing in renewables, they're in a good market, and they have a solid customer base. Those are all good things. But what about the risks? We can't ignore those.
Of course not. I think the biggest risk, as we've discussed, is their reliance on coal. As the world moves away from fossil fuels, that could become a major liability.
Yeah, definitely. And what about the cost of transitioning to renewables? That's got to be a huge financial burden.
It is. Investing in new technologies and infrastructure is expensive, and it could definitely impact Vistra's profitability in the short term.
And we can't forget about competition. There are a lot of other companies out there, both established players and startups, who are all vying for a piece of the renewable energy pie.
Absolutely. Vistra's going to have to fight hard to maintain its market share and stay ahead of the curve.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about Vistra's impressive earnings, the dramatic stock drop, the upcoming earnings report, the technical indicators, the analyst opinions, and the broader context of the energy transition.
We've really highlighted both the opportunities and the risks that are facing Vistra as they kind of navigate this complex and rapidly evolving landscape.
Right. It's a lot to take in, and I'm sure our listeners are still wondering, what's the bottom line? Hold or fold on VST?
Yeah, I wish I had a simple answer for that. But it's really not that straightforward. Ultimately, the decision comes down to your individual risk tolerance, your investment time frame, and your belief in Vistra's ability to adapt and succeed in the long term.
Sounds like a gamble, to be honest.
Well, investing always involves some level of risk, but that's kind of what makes it exciting.
True. It's all about weighing those potential rewards
Mm.
against the potential downsides. And in Vistra's case, there are some pretty compelling arguments on both sides.
Exactly. If you believe that Vistra can successfully navigate this energy transition and leverage its strengths to capitalize on the growing demand for clean energy, then holding on to your shares might be a good strategy.
But if you're more risk-averse, or you're really worried about the challenges ahead, then folding might be the safer option.
Right. There's really no right or wrong answer here.
So what advice would you give to our listeners? As they're wrestling with this decision, what are some key things they should be thinking about?
Well, I think the most important thing is to do your own research. Don't just rely on what you hear on this podcast, or from any other source for that matter.
Yeah.
Really dig into Vistra's financials. Read their reports, analyze their strategy, and form your own opinion.
That's great advice. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to investing. And don't be afraid to seek out different perspectives. Talk to other investors, read analyst reports, and consider all sides of the story before making a decision.
Absolutely. And remember, investing is a marathon, not a sprint. Don't get too caught up in the short-term fluctuations. Focus on the long game and make decisions that align with your overall investment goals.
That's a really great point. Sometimes it's easy to get swept up in the hype or the panic. But it's important to stay focused on your own financial plan.
Exactly. And finally, remember that there's no shame in seeking professional advice. If you're feeling overwhelmed or unsure, a financial advisor can help you assess your risk tolerance, develop a personalized investment strategy, and guide you through these tough decisions.
That's a great reminder. Sometimes it's helpful to have an expert in your corner.
Yeah.
Well, folks, it sounds like Vistra is kind of at a crossroads here. They've got a lot of potential, but they're also facing some pretty serious headwinds in this, changing energy landscape. It's definitely a stock to watch closely.
I agree. That upcoming earnings report on February 26th is going to be crucial. It could give us some more clues about, how Vistra is handling this transition.
Yeah.
And what their plans are for the future.
So mark your calendars, everyone. February 26th is the date to watch. Now, before we wrap up, I want to touch on one more thing that we haven't really talked about yet. Investor sentiment.
Ah, yes. The psychological side of investing. That's often the wild card.
Yeah.
That can really make or break a stock.
Exactly. And right now, it seems like there's a lot of uncertainty and fear surrounding Vistra. That recent price drop definitely shook people's confidence.
Yeah. And that fear can be contagious. It can lead to more selling, which drives the price down even further. And it creates a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy.
That's a scary thought. So how can investors avoid getting caught up in that emotional roller coaster?
Well, it's tough, but I think it comes back to what we discussed earlier. Do your research, understand the company's fundamentals, and make informed decisions based on logic, not fear.
And remember, investing is a long game. Don't let those short-term fluctuations dictate your long-term strategy.
Exactly. If you believe in Vistra's long-term potential and you're comfortable with the risks involved, then don't let a temporary dip scare you away.
But on the flip side, if you're having second thoughts, or you're losing sleep over your investment, maybe it's time to reassess your position.
Yeah, it's always better to cut your losses early than to ride a sinking ship all the way to the bottom.
Wise words. So, to sum it all up, Vistra Corp is a company at a pivotal moment. They've got a strong track record, but they're facing some big challenges. In this new energy landscape, their future success will depend on their ability to adapt, to innovate, and to win over investors.
The next few months will be critical. Watch for signs of progress in their transition to renewables and pay close attention to their earnings reports and guidance.
And most importantly, do your own research. Make informed decisions that align with your personal risk tolerance and your investment goals.
Don't just follow the herd or rely on headlines. Think critically, analyze the data, and trust your gut.
Well, folks, I think we've covered just about everything there is to say about Vistra Corp for now. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and I hope you all found it valuable.
As always, we appreciate you tuning into Investing Talk Podcast.
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Share this episode with your fellow investors, and leave us a comment below. We love hearing your thoughts and questions.
Until next time, happy investing, everyone.